with the great Professor William Henry.
While we're setting that up, I saw a really interesting little announcement on the religion page yesterday. And I was gonna bring it with me, I forgot it, but it said, due to illness, the healing service is scheduled for a certain time. Never thought I'd see something like that in the paper. You hear about it.
I've been listening to your thing on the radio station.
Oh, YCTV,
Yeah,
you're watching it, aren't you, not just listening?
She goes.
Because
to
the
bed
slides
at
are
night.
better than I am,
She goes to bed at night, puts her
I
headphones on, and sleep with it.
so you go to sleep with it.
Exactly.
This is getting worse all the time.
I'll listen to them over and over that way, something is sticking there.
So,
Hopefully, the pictures are worth maybe more than the commentary. Since it was brought up, I didn't bring it up. I do have a TV program called Discovering His Story, which covers what we're doing now, only way back at the very beginning in ancient times on yctv.org. So tune into that. And right now, did you watch the ones that are on now, or are you going back through the archives?
The ones that are on there.
Okay, I think it's Egypt. Is it still? How do you know? You fell asleep.
That's right.
So it's the one that, out to, through,
Oh, I didn't.
I can't remember.
Evidences for Young Earth.
Yes.
That's the first episode.
Yes.
So
that's
you're
the one
in,
that-
you're in the archives then.
Oh, okay.
You're not.
Yeah, I just grabbed the first thing that popped up.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. Start with the first one. The ones that are live, the ones live now, I think is about Egypt still. I think I probably had 5 programs at least on Egypt. And then I'm not sure if it's this week or not. It moves into the land of Canaan. What were the people like there? And what happened is Israel came in. But for tonight, in this class, we are finishing up. We won't finish up, but we're getting towards the end of the Middle Ages. We started last year, I think, in the Middle Ages, and have progressed through. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you probably learned things about the Middle Ages you didn't know were true, or didn't think there was anything that happened in the Middle Ages, but there were lots of things. And we started looking, I think last week, at the advent of emphasis on learning. Our last couple of weeks on learning and development of universities, and then the coming into existence of a group of men called the Scholastics. And we were looking at a couple of them last time. The last one we looked at was Thomas Aquinas, who is considered one of the greatest theologians in the Roman Catholic Church, certainly, if not just in Christianity. Tonight, we're going to continue looking at some of the more famous of the scholastics. I'm not covering all of them, nor am I covering everything about each one of them. So if you are interested in any of these guys, you can look them up and find out more about them than I am telling you. All right, so we're on bottom of page 9 in your notes. I have to say that I'm always a little bit concerned dealing with academic issues and men like this, because they're so over my head, all of our heads, that you're trying to understand what they were saying, what they believe, and I'm just wondering how many will doze off while we're doing it. And I think particularly tonight, this is I feel badly for our visitors tonight, Jesse and Angela, right? Because you're coming in at Probably, well, what may be the least interesting of all the times that we've spent. We'll see. Maybe I'm setting myself up for failure in telling you that, but hopefully it'll be somewhat interesting. You'll find something that you can identify with. So after Thomas Aquinas, the next guy that we're going to look at, you've probably heard of. His name is Bonaventure. If nothing else, you've heard of the university called Bonaventure. First of all, his life. You can see the years there in your outline. So all this is taking place in the 13th century. He's Italian, so his name is Giovanni, which we translate as John. He's from Fidanza, so he's called John Fidanza. He joined the Franciscans, that order of priests in the Roman Catholic Church, when he was 17, and became one of its greatest theologians, and the person most responsible for the organization and growth of the Franciscan order. There are several main orders in the Roman Catholic Church. There's the Dominican order and the Franciscan order. Those are two of the main ones. And the Franciscans were more interested in education, the Dominicans in missions. He was known as Bonaventure, or the Seraphic, as in seraphim. You recall what seraphim are? Seraphim?
Angels.
Angels. So he's the seraphic or angelic doctor. That was the compliment. While at the University of Paris, he became a Franciscan and became friends with Thomas Aquinas, that we talked about last week. They both received their doctorates in 1267, and he provided the Franciscan intellectual counterpart to the Dominican monk. So Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, and he was this great intellectual, wrote the Summa Theologica, wrote this great volume on theology. So Bonaventure was the Franciscan counterpart, intellectual, and we'll see what he was able to accomplish. As his reputation within the church grew, he earned the position of Cardinal Bishop of Albano in 1273. Now, Bonaventure was not eager to become a prince of the church or a bishop. When the papal envoys came bearing the cardinal's wide-brimmed hat, the story goes, they found Bonaventure washing dishes outside of a Florence convent. Rather than interrupt himself from his task, he told the envoys to hang the hat on a nearby tree until he had time to free his hands. That shows you that he was not all that interested in promoting himself and was rather a humble character. Next, his works. Bonaventure incorporated some of Aristotle's ideas. Aristotle, that great Greek philosopher that had become recently well known in 13th century Europe. And he had incorporated some of Aristotle's ideas into his more traditional philosophical framework, but he did not attempt to adjust his entire metaphysical system, that is, a system of other than physical. Metaphysical means beside the physical. So not necessarily spiritual, but at least the non-physical realm. He did not attempt to adjust his ideas about that to Aristotle's ideas. He also reacted against the purely intellectual theorizing that he perceived was becoming dominant in academic circles. So he saw that in the universities and among those that were doing a lot of thinking, that there was a lot of emphasis now, a newfound emphasis on intellectual stuff, academic stuff, and all this philosophizing. But he was determined that with the intellectual thinking, with reasoning, that they needed to keep love, compassion, and an awareness of nature's abundance as integral parts of daily spiritual development. Such love for the beauty of creation and the realization of God's love in each creature can be seen in all of his theological works. So he was grounded in that, love, compassion, and enjoying nature. And you can see that in the quotation. In things of beauty, he contemplated the one who is supremely beautiful, and led by the footprints he found in creatures. He followed the beloved everywhere. So he was able to appreciate God in everything he saw as he enjoyed nature. His theology consisted of three basic pillars. The first was the authority of the church and her tradition and of the scriptures. I found it interesting that as well as the scriptures kind of was tacked on to the authority of the church and her tradition. And as we've talked before in the Roman Catholic Church, there was an emphasis on tradition as being authoritative alongside the scriptures, so that the scriptures did not dominate what the church thought, but the church dominated what they said the scriptures taught. And tradition was a big part of that. Believing that all knowledge comes from an illumination of the word brought him to the implication that all the various sciences are ordered toward the knowledge of God, and that they therefore culminate in theology. In other words, since all knowledge comes from understanding God's word, when we look at nature, we look at the world, and we try to understand what is there, that ultimately takes us back to God. It takes us towards the knowledge of God. However, it's important to understand that even though reason is beneficial for Bonaventure, faith stands authoritatively alone, requiring no proofs, because that which is believed is based on an act of the will and not on a rational exercise. Therefore, theology is more than a science. It is a wisdom. Okay, I'll try to restate that. What he's saying is that faith doesn't require proof. You believe, and you believe regardless of whether there's any proof or not. You believe something because you think it is trustworthy. So you believe God, you believe the Bible. And that is because belief is an act of the will, not a rational exercise. Belief is a matter of choice. You choose to believe. It's not because you figured it out. It's a matter of choice. That's what he means by will. And so theology is more than a science. Science is using your mind to try to understand things. He says theology, the study of God, is more than just trying to understand things from facts that you're able to gather. Theology, he says, is a wisdom. Having faith in God, trying to understand God is a form of wisdom. It's how to live. All right. I'll stop at each one of these points and see if you have any questions or comments. So any comments or questions on this first pillar of his theology, the authority of the church and tradition and of the scriptures? And his main point there is that faith can stand alone. You don't need reason in order to have faith, but all reason points to God. All right, we'll go to the second pillar. And that is, he had a profound piety of the Franciscan type. Piety is a word that simply means devotion. Devotion to God usually is how it's used. The purpose of his theology is not to solve or to discover the deepest mysteries of God, but rather to enable men to have communion with God and to contemplate him. So in other words, he's not trying to figure everything out. He said the purpose of studying God is so that you can have communion with him, so you can think about him. Sometimes even as Bible-believing Christians, we can get caught up in Bible study and trying to figure things out so much that we forget that we're really studying about God. And so that's a good good thing for us to keep in mind. Is to have communion with God and to contemplate him. He thought that no proof needed to be given for God's existence since it was evident. So you look around, God's existence is evident. Although because of the effects of the fall upon the mind of man, so when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, all after them are tainted with the fall, and that affects the minds of man. Bonaventure conceded the ontological argument of Anselm as being valuable. Anselm we talked about before. Ontological simply means what is real. And so Anselm's argument is, for whatever there is that's real in its imperfections, there has to be a perfect reality in order for there to be imperfections of reality, or different degrees of different things in reality. So the ontological movement, he said, he thought was true, but really not necessary. The contemplation of God in meditation, he said, ought to focus on the humanity of Christ. So when you're thinking about God, he felt it was useful to think about the humanness of Jesus, because there's always a tendency to go one way or the other. He went to the direction of thinking about the humanity of Jesus rather than his deity. On a side note, it should be mentioned that Bonaventure opposed the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes with someone who put it. The Immaculate Conception of Mary is the belief that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was born perfect, that she was born without sin, as being necessary for her to give birth to the Savior, who was also born without sin. So they didn't care to take it back further than that, but that's what some were thinking. And he opposed that. He claimed that his position was more reasonable and was in concert with the authority of the saints. So he said, in the past, my position is what the fathers, the church fathers, believed. All right, any comments or questions about his piety, his emphasis in communion with God, contemplating him, focusing on the humanity of Christ?
So this is how we know that football is such an important sport, right? Because you got the Hail Mary, you got the Immaculate Reception.
It shows how the church has influenced sports announcers.
Right.
What it shows. Trying to remember those who came up with those, were they Roman Catholic announcers? I think maybe they were.
Probably, yeah.
Although the Hail Mary was, I think during it was first used during a Notre Dame football game, if I remember. So anyway. Any other comments? Okay, the third pillar of his theology is a bit shorter. He built his entire theology within the philosophical framework that he had received from Augustine, Hugh of St. Victor, and Alexander of Hales. In case any of you want to ask who are Hugh of St. Victor and Alexander of Hales, I'll tell you up front, I have no idea. I didn't have time to look them up. Sorry about that, but I've never come across them before. Notice he says there, if you learn everything except Christ, you learn nothing. If you learn nothing except Christ, you learn everything. So it's all about Christ. Any comments there? All right, his legacy. The Franciscans became strongly divided in the 13th century over Francis, the originator of the Franciscan order. His ideal apostolic purity. Remember, he taught that they should live pure lives and live in poverty. One group called the Spirituals denounced all property ownership as a compromise with the curse of original sin. Somehow attached material things to original sin. They said, if you own property, you're participating in sin. The other group, the conventuals, saw the Franciscan mission as including an embrace of the world and its trappings. So within the Franciscan order, you had two opposing sides. The ability of Bonaventure to calmly and judiciously listen to both sides of an argument and to bring acceptable compromise saved the order from disorder, and he was able to offer a balanced position to the warring factions. In fact, Bonaventure died doing that for which he became known, attempting to bring people together. He was endeavoring to heal the schism between the Roman and the Greek churches when he died just a year after becoming cardinal. There are some who believe he was poisoned. Don't know for sure. Here's some of his quotes. If you would like to comment on it, please raise your hand and do so. Chastity without charity is a lamp without oil. You can see how that would fit into his times, as there were many in the Franciscan order and other orders that were practicing chastity, but didn't have much charity. Just as even today, we can practice all the purity that we think a Christian ought to, but as 1 Corinthians 13 tells us, if we don't have charity in the King James Version or love, then it's just a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal, or a lamp without oil. Any other comments? I like this one. He said, any old woman can love God better than a doctor of theology can. Tells you a little about the dedication of the doctors of theology, maybe at his time, and maybe of our time today too. All right, the next one. The best perfection of a religious man is to do common things in a perfect manner. A constant fidelity in small things is a great and heroic virtue. We've all heard people say it's the small things that cannot do the small things well. Any other comments? And the last one, and it seems like all of them have something like this in their quotes. Mary seeks for those who approach her devoutly and with reverence. For such she loves, nourishes, and adopts as her children. Now, if you said God seeks for those who approach her, we might be able to go along with that somewhat, but the emphasis upon Mary is something that is just part of the religious culture at the time. So no matter how much good these guys may say and advocate, they still fall back into some of these Roman Catholic ideas that have developed over the centuries. All right, go to the next guy. I think maybe you've heard of the next guy too. If not, you've heard of something about him. John Duns Scotus, or Scotus. Perhaps no great medieval thinker is as little understood, someone wrote, as John Duns Scotus. Scholars cannot agree when or where he was born. Students try to avoid reading his dense work, and some theologians wonder if he strayed into heresy. The most common reference to his name, sadly, is the derogatory epithet dunce, used to describe someone who cannot give a simple answer. More positively, he is known as the subtle doctor. His life, probably born in the Scottish lowlands, Scotus joined the Franciscans, studying at Oxford until 1301, and being named Franciscan Regent Master at the University of Paris. There he became known as the greatest theologian of his generation. Next, his ideas. John Duns Scotus's ideas are difficult to describe, since he went from topic to topic without delineation or clarification. He definitely had a positive view of the human will, as opposed to both Aquinas and Augustine. So in other words, he believed that man had the ability to exercise his will in a good way. Not being content with Anselm's view that the existence of God was self-evident, he promoted the theory of what he called univocal prediction of being, based upon the idea that the existence of God must be proven. So some had said the existence of God is self-evident. He said, no, you got to prove it. You've got to prove it in such a way that a person can exercise their will to believe it. He did so on a metaphysical basis of the existence of non-material being. Non-material being. That's what metaphysics is. Scotus followed the contingent to necessary argument of Aquinas. That is, if something is contingent or based upon something else or comes from something else, then you have to trace that back to saying, well, it has to be something which is necessary to exist before all the contingencies can exist. Did that make sense at all? Or do I need to say that a different way? I'm getting blank stare. All right, I'll say it a different way. Tell me if this helps or not. If there's something, anything that exists is the product of something else that exists, right? Which is the product of something else that existed before that, and before that. So eventually you come back to there's one thing that's absolutely necessary in order for everything, all the contingencies to exist. Did that make sense? Better than the first attempt? All right, so that's what he promoted. I'm sorry, that was Aquinas's idea that he kind of went along with, but he applied it in the realm of being itself, apart from any material aspect. So Aquinas was referring to physical entities, but Duns Scotus applied it to non-physical entities, just the idea of being, which is also called ontological. So if there's anything, apart from physical, just something that is in a non-physical way, so we might say that which is spiritual, the spiritual world, or anything which is not physical, that you also could do the same thing and trace that back to that which is necessary, which brings you to God. So that's what he called the univocal prediction of being. In other words, there univocal, one voice. There's one voice prediction of being. In other words, you can predict that there's going to be one source of everything that exists. That's predictable. Take that back. The attribute of God, thus discovered by reasoning this way, that elicited the most discussion was his emphasis on the divine will, which Scotus argued was primary over reason. So the divine will, the will of God, is over reason, resulting in the primacy of love over knowledge. So, in other words, he's looking at God and saying, as you're looking at all the attributes of God, the primary attribute of God, which is over everything else, is the attribute of love, which is an act of his will. So that his will takes precedence over what he knows, his knowledge. And so, and that he called voluntarism. So there's a primacy of love over knowledge. Will comes first and then reason. Even though Scotus believed that the existence of God must be proven, he accepted the doctrines of the church on the basis of authority and not of rational demonstration. So that seemed to me to be a little bit contradictory, because he's saying if you to push the belief of God, you have to prove it. You have to show it's reasonable, But then he said, but I believe everything the church says, and I don't have to reason that out at all. As a noted medievalist, as a student of medieval times, has said, Duns Scotus had considerably increased the list of those revealed truths which a Christian should believe but cannot prove. So at a time when even among the scholastics, there was an attempt to demonstrate the reasonableness of Christian doctrine, if not biblical doctrine, the doctrines of the church. Duns Scotus says, we accept the doctrines of the church, whether we can reasonably explain them or understand them or not, or whether we can prove them or not. There's that last quote. All right, any questions or comments at this point? You feel like you're getting lost in the woods here? Bumping into trees? Yeah, I understand. I kind of felt that way when I was researching this, trying to figure out some of what these guys believed and trying to put it in terms that are understandable was not an easy task. And that's to say, it's more complicated than what I'm telling you. Here's a couple of interesting things. Scotus felt that the incarnation, that is, the Son of God becoming the God-man, God becoming man, becoming incarnated in human flesh, he said that was inevitable even if sin had not occurred. So we think of the incarnation as being necessary because of the sin of man, that to pay the penalty for the sin of man, it must be necessary for God to become man, to provide that sacrifice. He said the incarnation would have happened even if there hadn't been sin, as the primary object of the divine love, being the focal point of the entire purpose of God, even apart from human sin. So what he's saying is that God's love for humans was such that he would have come as man anyway, even if there wasn't sin. Regarding Christ's redemption, well, I don't know, any comments on that? What do you think? He's the only person I ever heard address that. And of course, it's one of the speculative things. What if? Probably know what if. But I think that in the Garden of Eden, God was able to come and walk and talk with Adam and Eve without taking on real human flesh, just in the appearance of flesh, I suppose. But so I think the primary purpose was to provide a sacrifice. Okay, next one. And here's where I think we would have a problem. He said, regarding Christ's redemption, Scotus varied from Anselm's satisfaction view. Remember, Anselm said that Christ's death on the cross was to provide satisfaction or to satisfy God's justice, because the wages of sin is death. And in order for sin to be covered, there must be death. And death is what all of we sinners deserve, but Christ, as a substitute, provided death in our place and provided that satisfaction to God of the justice that was required. Scotus didn't agree with that. He said that satisfaction is not necessarily required, and God could have forgiven man without any satisfaction whatsoever. If a satisfaction was to be offered, it did not have to be from the God-man. And in any case, the merits of Christ, since they are the merits of the human will, are not in themselves infinite. So he said, because what Christ did in this life were done as a human, those acts are not of infinite value, and therefore could not be used in our place as a satisfaction in our place. Because I think correct theology teaches that not only was Christ's death a substitution for us, in providing satisfaction to the justice of God, but his life also was a substitution for us and living the life that we could not possibly live. And so that's where we get, not only in his death, we have the negative of what we owe to God, that is death from sin, but the righteousness that is credited to us is because of the life of Jesus, that the life he lived is counted toward us as well. Do you follow? Does that make sense? And he's denying that that's the case, which fits in then to Roman Catholic theology, which says that, which teaches that you gain merit, you don't have enough merit of your own. And so where do you get this extra merit? Not from Jesus. No, you get it from saints that have gone on previously that have done extra good deeds, and you can draw on their merit. So his teaching that Jesus' merit was not of infinite worth itself kind of fits into that. Any comments? All right, now here's where he is at variance with Bonaventure and created quite an issue at the time. He promoted the Immaculate Reception. You got it.
I got you. That's right.
The Immaculate Conception of Mary. And as I said, the idea is that Mary herself was conceived without a sin nature. Some church fathers have brought up the idea of Mary's sinlessness, but Scotus was the first to suggest that she was free from inherited sin because Christ's grace was applied to her preventatively at her own conception. Although opposed by many at the time, the Immaculate Conception was made dogma, that is, church doctrine, in 1854. Many people misunderstand the Immaculate Conception as referring to the conception of Jesus in Mary, but it's not. It's talking about the conception of Mary in her mother's womb is without sin. With the passing of Scotus, a process of decline began, which would eventually destroy the entire scholastic edifice. So scholasticism went downhill after Scotus. All right, any comments about the Immaculate Conception or John Duns Scotus? Most of the guys that I've talked about, I have recommended, try reading some. Thomas Aquinas, others. Anselm. I don't know if I'd even suggest trying to read Duns Scotus. It's really difficult and not of much value, I don't think. Any comments or questions?
Just further shows how they're, philosophically focused rather than Bible focused.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. There's very little among the scholastics that is an appeal to Scripture. Because remember that, as I mentioned last week, it's a really big deal that now they have access to Aristotle and the other Greek philosophers that they had never known before. And as these things became available, it became very popular. It was, the pop culture was Aristotle. Read Aristotle. Oh, how does Aristotle fit in with Roman Catholic theology? Oh, we got to figure that out. And a lot of what these guys are doing is figuring that out. All right, the last one, I think he's the last one, is William of Ockham. Now, his name is spelled a couple different ways. Let's see, how do I spell it there? OCC, sometimes it's, OCH, I think. So you may see it different ways even on the slides. He was a Franciscan also at the University of Oxford. Oxford, of course, is in what country? Everybody? I'm not sure I heard that. England, thank you. And just 100 years prior to this, I thought this was interesting. Franciscan friars were unknown in England. They first landed in England on September 10th, 1224. There were 9 poorly dressed men that immediately upon arriving found their way to an affluent farmhouse where they successfully begged for food. They were told that they could spend the night in the barn. But when they woke up, they found themselves locked in and surrounded by suspicious neighbors. The local magistrates questioned them. Their lives were in danger unless they could prove they were not vagabonds, robbers, spies, or heretics. They explained they were Franciscans, but no one had ever heard of the Franciscans. That was relatively new. Finally, one of the Franciscans took his rope belt and said, "If you believe us to be either criminals or heretics, then take these cords from around our waists and hang us from the beams of this barn." Did they? His boldness swayed the crowd in their favor. Led by Agnellus of Pisa, the friars and their lay associates headed for Canterbury, where they were much more kindly received. Their coming to England spurred much needed reforms. According to Robert Grosseteste, a prominent English bishop, the church was in a sad state of corruption. Many of the clergy were ignorant. They idled, gambled, haunted taverns, rioted, and indulged in sexual sin. Grosseteste disciplined his see, which is the area ruled over by a bishop, but many other bishops were corrupt or lived too far away to notice rampant evils in theirs. In contrast to the arrogance which marked the higher clergy, the friars apologized quickly if they offended anyone. Far from flouting wealth, they walked barefoot and lived simply. They founded friaries across England in which they sang and prayed. From these bases, they recruited followers, cared for the sick, and preached to the poor. The people listened gladly to their teaching. By their example, they raised the standard of religious practice in England. Bishop Robert Grosseteste became their guide. He warned them to fix themselves on Scripture, or they too would become corrupt. Because of their popularity, his warning was needed. By mid-century, there were 50 friaries. Before the end of the century, the friars themselves were accumulating wealth and beginning the drift which would cause John Wycliffe to denounce them in the 14th century. So that's the beginning of the Franciscans in England, of which William of Ockham was a part. William of Ockham was a nominalist. He said that ultimate reality does not exist beyond us or in the world around us, but in our own minds. Nomenos is the word for mind. So he believed strongly in the human mind. That's where ultimate reality is in the mind. Ockham divorced reason and faith as avenues or means to arrive at the truth. One must accept blindly the word of the church, however. So he said reason or faith can be an avenue to truth. But whatever the church says, you have to accept as truth. Now, the one thing that you maybe have heard of in relationship to him is what's called Occam's razor. You ever heard of that? Occam's razor? That is this. This is that it's kind of reasoning. If you have more than one possible explanation for a phenomenon, you should always choose the simplest one. I've heard this used in mysteries, whether it's a movie mystery. I think Sherlock Holmes says something like this, and others as well. Pick the simplest explanation. Here's an example. Why did the tree fall down? 2 explanations. The wind knocked the tree down. Second explanation, there were 2 meteorites. One hit the tree and knocked it down. Then it hit the other meteorite, thus obliterating the evidence of its existence. That's why we don't see any meteorites there. Well, which is the simplest explanation? The tree. I'm sorry, the wind knocked the tree down. So the simplest explanation is the best one. Any comments about Occam's razor? How many have heard Occam's razor referred to? Okay, just. You probably heard it, you just don't remember. I hear some of the things he said. It is vain to do with more what can be done with fewer. So you get the idea that William of Ockham was really in favor of simplistic explanations and keeping simple. So what do you think about that? It's vain to do with more than more. It is vain to do with more what can be done with fewer.
Sounds like a good motto for decluttering.
Yeah.
Something in that closet.
I think of a similar statement. Was it too many cooks spoil the broth? Better to go with one. Okay, another. Entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. There's the cluttering thing again. Don't go beyond what's necessary.
Sometimes less is more. Did you ever hear
Yeah,
that one?
yeah, less is more. Yeah. God's existence cannot be deduced by reason alone. That's there. I think that's true, because we know that there are many brilliant people who have the facts about the existence of God, and yet still refuse to believe. So reasoning did not bring them to faith. All right, let's summarize scholasticism. First of all,
Bill, did he have a certain story in mind or something with his Occam's razor? Is there like a certain history thing behind that? Or
I didn't come across anything like an example
yeah,
that
I
he
guess I
gave.
wasn't sure. Yeah,
I didn't come across anything. Probably is if one digs deeper. All right, scholasticism. It supported church doctrine through study, reason, and logic. And this is somewhat of an improvement, because throughout most of the Middle Ages, church doctrine was supported through just accept it. But now people are becoming more educated. They want to know reasons behind things. Secondly, it opposed mysticism and the simple view of the world as a struggle of good and evil. So, contrary to William of Ockham, it was not a simple thing to look at the world anymore. It was not just simply good and evil. There's more to it than that. Mysticism we'll talk about in a minute. Thomas Aquinas moved away from the Augustinian view, which was the accepted view of the church, although that's what they said. They didn't really follow his theology, and more toward Aristotelianism. And as we move into, I guess I'd say the following century, we'll find Aristotelianism really becomes dominant in the thinking of the Roman Catholic Church. The idea of tabula rasa, made popular by, was it Rousseau? I think the French Revolution. Aquinas said the mind at birth is a blank slate. Man is given the ability to think and recognize ideas through a divine spark. So none of this, their mind is totally affected by original sin, but there's a blank slate, and you can logically think through things through the divine spark that is given to you. The methodology was that theology was done within an Aristotelian framework. So Aristotle had a huge effect. The heavy use of syllogism. They took a general truth, one which is seen as being taken for granted, and then related it to particular facts. So again, that's called deductive reasoning. So you take a truth and then you find different facts that support it or illustrate it, whatever. But you don't question that general truth. That's the opposite of inductive reasoning, where you take the individual things that you see, observations that you make, and build up to then a truth that can be induced from that. Next, then they used any relationship evident between the two to come to a conclusion which became a new truth. So in a sense, this is pre-Hegelian dialectic. I mean anything to most of you, but Marx promoted what was called dialectical materialism. That is, there's always a thesis, an idea, and for every idea, there's an opposite idea, which is called the antithesis. And history is full of theses and antitheses, and there's always a combination of the two, which is called a synthesis, the bringing together. That synthesis then becomes a new thesis, for which there's an antithesis, and then a new synthesis, and so on. Marx says that's why history evolves, and he got that from Hegel, and maybe Hegel got it from the scholastics, because they had this idea that there's a new truth that comes evident when you're debating issues. It was from this mode of doing theology that new theological development took place during the period of the scholastics. Okay, let's look at we'll examine the movement here. Aristotle's system of thought in interpreting their faith, excuse me, using Aristotle's system of thought in interpreting their faith, they hoped to reconcile the teachings of the church and the writings of Aristotle, settling the controversy between faith and reason. So you had the faith of the church, you had reason from Aristotle. They hoped to settle the controversies between the two. This attempt to apply human reasoning to spiritual truth often led them into error. And some of what they believed in their faith was an error too. So, you got lots of error going on. Placing reason above faith made spiritual truth dependent upon logical reasoning. And we find that a lot today. People want to judge the Bible, judge spiritual truth based upon their own logical reasoning. An overemphasis on reason took them, the using of the mind, took them beyond profitable learning and left them with empty speculations. So in other words, they were so enamored with thinking and speculating and figuring stuff out that they were making new stuff up all the time to try to figure out. So they came up with such foolish questions as, are angels brighter in the mornings or in the evenings? At what hour of the day did Adam sin? Real important stuff like that. Here's one that really we've got to find the answer to. Will a man at the resurrection recover all his fingernail clippings? And probably the one you've heard of, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? I mean, this is the stuff that occupied their minds because they're just trying to think deeper and deeper, or maybe deeper is not the right word, but empty speculations. Remember the Apostle Paul warned us about empty speculations. He certainly could have had these guys in mind. Next, their attempts to explain their faith revealed many contradictions in the traditional teachings of the church. So that was one good thing that came out of this. They began to see that some of the teachings of the church really contradicted one another. And God used that years later as men began looking not to Aristotle and logic and reasoning, but began looking to the revelation of God in the Bible as the only infallible source of truth to address those inconsistencies. We're going to be getting to that. Now, anytime there is a movement that emphasizes one particular way of doing things or thinking, there's always going to be somebody that goes the opposite way. And so in reaction to the overemphasis on reason came the dawn of mysticism. This was an experience-oriented approach, as opposed to the mind-centered approach, the reasoning approach Now you've got an experience-oriented approach, which offered spiritual insight for personal devotion as well as instruction to others. Mystics claim to see and feel their perceptions. Women were largely the ones drawn to these mystic revelations. That these mystics were humble and insistent that their knowledge should be shared can be demonstrated by Dame Julian of Norwich, who said in her showings, "God forbid that you should say or assume that I am a teacher, for I am a woman, ignorant, weak, and frail. But I know very well that what I am saying I have received by the revelation of him who is the sovereign teacher. Because I am a woman, ought I therefore to believe that I should not tell you of the goodness of God when I saw at that same time that it is his will that it be known?" So these mystics are claiming not only to have spiritual experiences, but sometimes are claiming to have received revelation from God that they are then sharing with others. Now, much of what these mystics recorded consisted of worshipful reflections addressed to God. We might call them devotional writings. Julian of Norwich wrote, "God, of your goodness, give me yourself, for you are sufficient for me. I cannot properly ask anything less to be worthy of you. If I were to ask less, I should always be in want. In you alone do I have all." That doesn't sound so bad. And it's not. And there are certainly some good sentiments to be found in some of these mystical writings. In fact, I think that the book, The Imitation of Christ, comes out of this time, out of this movement. I'm not certain about that. Maybe some of you have read or you've heard The Imitation of Christ, but it is in that sort of an anti-intellectual, experience-oriented movement among Christians. Now, some followers of these mystical pietists bound together in communities, dedicating themselves to manual labor and cultivation of the inner self through study and meditation, mutual confession of sins, and the imitation of the life of Christ. Now, that sounds very much like the original monasteries, doesn't it? And even some of the orders. But those had all gone to pot. So here's a new movement. The problem with this one is that this movement unintentionally undermined the authority of the church, as in community, Roman church practices became unnecessary. Say that again. When they're functioning in a community, the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, that is, when you went to a church service and the mass and everything that's going on there, became unnecessary because they're having spiritual experiences apart from the practices of the church. So emphasizing the experiential over the rational, mysticism also contributed to the decline of scholasticism. Because you can only stand intellectualizing so long before you say, I want to feel something. All right, any comments about mysticism? Certainly we can see that in our culture today, in our churches today. All right. We'll move on to something a little less heady, I think. And that is medieval science. Medieval science consisted of magic, superstition, and tradition. But we're going to see some changes coming. First of all, astrologers sought to interpret the future from the position of the stars. That was a part of science in the Middle Ages, predicting the future. So you have astrologers. You have alchemists who attempted to transform non-valuable metals into gold. You've probably heard of that if you've watched any movies that take place in the Middle Ages or whatever. You know, somebody's always trying to find a way to transfer lead into gold, but you can find lead all around, but gold, and it's not valuable. So they're attempting to do this. And then thirdly, there are handbooks of knowledge called encyclopedias, which contain scientific information that had been handed down from ancient sources. That's the tradition. The compilers of these volumes did not question the accuracy of their sources, often passing down gross misconceptions and falsehoods. Again, just like in the realm of the church, they were to believe whatever they were told. In the realm of science, they were to believe whatever they were told and not question it. That's going to change, thankfully, as we come to the discovery of the scientific method. You remember the scientific method from junior high or high school? Does that ring a bell, the scientific method? Anybody remember what the scientific method was? I mean, very simply, it's not like a formula or anything. It's just what?
Remember all the
Well,
steps.
don't even be that specific. What do you do if you're exercising the scientific method? What are you doing?
Solve a problem.
Solving a problem by what?
Questioning.
By questioning?
Testing.
What's that? Testing? Observing?
Evaluating the results.
Yeah, right. So, as the Greek and Muslim works began to circulate, remember, as a result of the Crusades, especially, and increased trade with the Middle East and the East, Greek and Muslim works began to find their way into Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries. Some began to critically re-examine inherited scientific ideas. I don't know if you remember way back when we talked about Islam, and we looked at some of the books, some of the science that was being used and had been written down by Muslim scientists, and how they had drawn pictures of the circulatory system and different things in the body. They had all this scientific information that Europe was totally ignorant. And so as these things are working their way into Europe, people began to say, maybe what's in that encyclopedia I've been using isn't quite right. And the guy who is given credit for bringing about this revolution in science is Roger Bacon. And Roger Bacon advocated observation and experimentation, two key words of the scientific method. Observation and experimentation as tests for scientific conclusions. Observation and experimentation. Okay, now I'm going to test your reasoning ability and your memory. What kind of reasoning is that? It's different than what many of the scholastics were doing, and those in the church for centuries. What kind of logic is it? All right. Is it deductive or inductive? Deductive. It's inductive. You had a 50-50 chance. Deductive, remember, is looking at something that you accept as true. And deductive is then you find things that you think support it, but you don't question what's there. Inductive is, and I don't know if there's a good way to remember this or not, if anybody has one. Inductive, you're starting in on the ground floor and you're observing things and you're building from that. And then you come to conclusions based on your experiments, based on your observations. That's inductive reasoning. Now, when it comes to Bible study, either way, has benefits. So it's a good thing to have a Bible truth and then look in the Bible and see, well, where is that supported? As long as we are not afraid to say, maybe what I believe isn't really true. Maybe what I think the Bible says, it doesn't really say because I'm not finding support for it. But the best way to arrive at what does the Bible say is inductively. That is, studying the Bible, and through verse by verse, you build up an understanding of what the Bible says about things, and then you're able to put those together and come to conclusions. Well, Roger Bacon did that in science. He stated 4 principal stumbling blocks to comprehending truth. He said the example of frail and unworthy authority. In other words, depending on authority which is not correct, which is what they were doing with all these encyclopedias. They were depending on authorities that were not valid. The second stumbling block is long established custom. If you've been around for a while, you know that it's hard to go against long established customs, especially in the church. But we've never done it that way before. Or we've always done this. And that greatly affected how people studied science, because they had certain ideas that had been around and believed. All right, the third stumbling block was the sense of the ignorant crowd. In other words, to come up with a new idea, you're using your inductive observations, and you come up with a new way of looking at things based on facts that you've observed. But if the people in general don't believe that conclusion, you've got a hard time selling it. And so the maddening crowd, the ignorance of the masses. And then the fourth stumbling block is the hiding of one's own ignorance under the show of wisdom. When people are trying to pretend that they know so much and they're just covering up how much they don't know. Now, I'll give you an example where all 4 of these things come to bear. And I'm not going to say too much about it because we're going to talk about it later when we get to it. But think about Copernicus. You remember Copernicus? He promoted the idea that instead of the sun and all the planets circling around the earth, that actually the earth and the planets circled around the sun. Did he have any trouble promoting that idea? For all 4 of these reasons, right? And in fact, he came up against the church. He didn't have so much a problem, I think, because he died before it became too big of an issue, but Galileo did, as he promoted the heliocentric theory. But we'll talk about him when we get to it. All right, so here's the beginning of the scientific method. Any questions about medieval science and the changes that are beginning to take place for Roger Bacon? All right, next week, I'm planning on getting into language and literature. We're going to look at some of the literature that you hated to read in high school and maybe try to make more sense of it now. And if you want to get a step ahead, you can read Dante's Inferno or Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. I know you're anxious to get into that. Maybe after I tell you about it, you'll enjoy it more. All right, any final questions or comments?
I mean, just everything's better with bacon.
Yes.
Right? Bacon makes everything better.
It's true.
So who would have thought that the levity tonight on several occasions have been due to Brian's thinking of things that are not related. Okay, they're not quite done out there yet, so. Watch for that, or just hang around and talk for a few minutes if you like. We'll talk about something else we can.
Thank you, Bill.
Well, the Steelers and the Browns both pulled off a win today, when it looked like neither one of them was going to be successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Bengals bungled.
Yeah,
Yeah, 31 to 30.